What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back with the box office breakdown for Sunday, July 5th. Hope everybody had an amazing July 4th and managed to get through the holiday without losing any fingers messing around with firecrackers. And there was plenty of healthy competition at the movie theater this past weekend, but whether or not any of these movies managed to generate any fireworks remains to be seen. So let's start with Minions and Monsters, which opened well below projections with a franchise low of $36 million across the traditional 3-day weekend. But if you include the full 5-day holiday weekend since last Wednesday, it opened to $61 million, still well below the $80 million that was expected. And the story was a little bit more positive with international markets with $86 million, but the question now is whether or not this franchise is running out of gas. They've given us 7 movies in 16 years, but this is a rare franchise where I'm a complete and total blank slate on every single movie, so I'll spare you my usual over-the-top opinions and focus primarily on how its performance compares to the rest of the franchise. So I found this handy little chart over at the numbers, and here's the history of the box office performance of the Despicable Me franchise. So the very first movie opened in 2010 with a budget of $69 million, and on its opening weekend opened to $56 million and ended up reaching a grand total of $544 million. But then the franchise just took off like a rocket. Despicable Me 2 opened in 2013 to $84 million and eventually made it to $975 million. Minions, the first of the Minions movies, opened in 2015. It opened to $115 million and eventually made $1.1 billion. So clearly the Minions, the spin-off storyline actually became more popular than the main storyline. Despicable Me 3 opened in 2017 to $72 million, but eventually made it to $1 billion. Then in 2022, Minions: The Rise of Gru managed to open to $107 million before finally making it to $937 million. And then in 2024, Despicable Me 4 opened to $75 million before climbing to $986 million total. But with Minions and Monsters, we're seeing our first sharp decline in box office performance. And I've heard the movie's actually pretty good. I listened to a couple of reviews over the last couple days where people who aren't necessarily fans of the franchise overall were saying this is the best of the movies. Maybe they should have tried to make the movie worse. I don't know. I hate to sound that cynical, but sometimes better movies do underperform, and sometimes the dumber movies end up doing really, really well. But as I said before, I'm a total blank slate. I don't know how these various movies compare to one another, but I think we're starting to see alarming signs that the trend is at an end. So perhaps Illumination should focus on some other franchises or building some new franchises from scratch as opposed to leaning so heavily on Despicable Me and Minions and Monsters. But let's move on to the other major new release, Young Washington, which opened in number 3 to $20 million. And I'm assuming most of those tickets were sold in the state of Virginia where George Washington was born. But I am biased. I was also born in the state of Virginia, a state that's given us 8 presidents, a record for any state. And I still have a ton of relatives who make Virginia their home. But I'm ashamed to admit, I didn't see the movie. I spent the last couple days going to climbing walls around Manhattan, as well as a few beginner boulders up in Central Park. I've been suffering from this horrible stiffness down my left side from sitting at my computer too much editing videos. But if I ever get good enough at the climbing, I might have to post 1 or 2 shorts here on this channel. But getting back to Young Washington, the main takeaway is that Angel Studios continues to be relevant as a new player, and they managed to push Supergirl out of the number 3 spot that it was hoping for. But with all the new releases out of the way, let's get into a little juicy melodrama, because Supergirl suffered a calamitous 74% drop in its second weekend with only $9.6 million, and that would have been bruising enough. But what compounded the humiliation was this article over at Hollywood Reporter, basically tracking or tracing the history of 2 rival cuts of the movie. And it's a classic tale of creative differences between James Gunn, who produced the film, and Craig Gillespie, who directed it. So in case you missed the article, it's called Behind the Supergirl Bomb, Competing Cuts, Creative Differences, Exclusive. And the article is by Boris Kitt over at The Hollywood Reporter. And it's amazing just how quickly Hollywood insiders have embraced the fact that this movie is an abject failure and started offering up various postmortems. So I'm not going to read the entire article, but I just want to read 1 or 2 paragraphs just to give you an idea of what it was like behind the scenes over the last couple of months. Gunn and Gillespie had creative differences over the direction of the movie, numerous sources tell The Hollywood Reporter, and the film never found its footing in the post-production process. The test scores, which are counted on a scale out of 100 points, never escaped the 60s, according to multiple insiders. Another insider said the movie's top score was 70. They were not creatively aligned, is the polite way of describing things, said one insider.
This does not look like this is going to end well. for you guys.
And let me pause for a quick interruption because James Gunn, along with Peter Safran, is running DC. And James Gunn's responsible for the creative direction of the studio and making sure that all the shows and all the movies are more or less kind of moving in the same direction. He hired Craig Gillespie. How are they not creatively aligned? You would think they would look at the comic and then look at the very, very loose screenplay adaptation, have a discussion about what Craig Gillespie would do with the material, and then if he liked his pitch or his vision for the material, then move forward with them. But apparently Craig Gillespie never even bothered to read the comic upon which this movie was based, and I have a feeling that in the end, Craig Gillespie is just not that interested in superheroes, and more power to him. And if Gillespie's more interested in making movies like I, Tonya moving forward, fair play, like follow your gut, follow your instincts. But it's amazing to me that James Gunn and Craig Gillespie would not be creatively aligned on this giant production, which had a $170 million budget or more and $120 million in marketing, and they weren't on the same page about what kind of movie they were going to make. I mean, the reality is, my YouTube video or my review of the film, which generated 10,000 clicks, that video is going to make more money than this movie. But let's pick up a little deeper into the article. The movie had at least 4 test screenings, according to sources, with screenings held in December 2025 as well as February and March of this year. And while social media users and critics are dunking on the movie's use of a cover of the Jimmy Eat World song, The Middle, the big needle drop in the final set piece at the February screening was a cover version of Cyndi Lauper's Girls Just Want to Have Fun. That song choice came from Gunn, but it ultimately was abandoned for the Jimmy Eat World cover. And let me pause just to digest that information because I think there's a very good chance the movie would have been even worse if they had gone with Girls Just Want to Have Fun, and that was James Gunn's choice. James Gunn might be better off just directing movies, like his individual movies for the DC Universe moving forward, as opposed to being responsible for the overall slate. I don't know who you would get to run the overall slate, but who knows? Maybe Matt Reeves. Like Robert Meyer Burnett over the weekend brought up the idea that, like, if you look at Matt Reeves' movies and shows, which include the Batman as well as the Penguin, and then compare it to James Gunn's slate, which includes obviously Peacemaker Season 2, Superman, Supergirl, and Creature Commandos, I think Matt Reeves' rival DC slate right now is more interesting and more exciting than James Gunn's DC slate. Also, it's just idiotic for Warner Brothers to have 2 separate competing DC universes. Merge them or get rid of one, but they should just have DC movies and shows, and they should all be more or less in alignment. And I would vote that Matt Reeves might be a better choice for running DC than James Gunn. But keep James Gunn on board, let him finish Superman, Man of Tomorrow, and then go from there. But getting back to the article a little bit lower down, there were signs that things were getting better. Deep into winter, test scores improved and hit the low 70s. However, rather than continue to tinker away on that cut, the studio decided to force a bake-off by creating 2 cuts, one by Gillespie and one by the studio. It is unclear what major differences emerged, but one source says Gillespie's version was 11 minutes longer and featured more of the villain Krim, played by Matthias Schoenaerts. When the 2 competing versions tested, the score surprisingly dropped significantly, although the studios inched out ahead of Gillespie's, but by only 2 points, according to sources. Gillespie's version scored strongly in song choices, pacing, and villain, eking out a win, even a middling one. The studio chose its cut as the one to go into theaters. A studio insider says the differences were not particularly pronounced. So I think in the final analysis, this was just a very poorly conceived superhero project with a series of bad decisions that just compounded the problems. Like, they chose the wrong source material. They definitely chose the wrong screenwriter to adapt, Anna Nogueira, whose previous writing credit was a little short film from 2018. They definitely chose the wrong director, Craig Gillespie, who was not creatively aligned with James Gunn and his vision for the DC Universe. I would have recommended that you take this opportunity to flesh out the DC Universe. At a minimum, they should have used the movie Supergirl to help set up the next movie where Brainiac is going to be the main villain. Like when Kara Zor-El is sent away from that little fragment of Krypton floating in space, imagine if at the same time you'd seen Brainiac floating in on a ship and collecting that city and bottling it up for his collection so he can learn about Kryptonian technology or something along those lines. It would have made the scene far cooler and it would have made people much more excited for Superman, Man of Tomorrow. But these are just obvious things that would occur to any nerdy fan of superhero stories. And if you're wondering how Supergirl's second weekend drop compares to some other box office failures, here's some numbers to put it all in perspective. Joker Folie à Deux in 2024 had a second weekend drop of 80%. The Flash in 2023 had a second weekend drop of 73%. The Marvels in 2023 had a second weekend drop of 78%. Morbius in 2022 had a second weekend drop of 74%. And Dark Phoenix in 2019 had a second weekend drop of 72.6%. And keep in mind that Supergirl's opening weekend was pretty weak to begin with, so I think at this point we can officially add Supergirl to the Superhero Hall of Shame. Whether or not any filmmakers or producers or studios will learn any valuable lessons from this failure remains to be seen, but as we've seen many times throughout film history, studios oftentimes learn the wrong lesson from a failure. They learn the lesson that they want to learn as opposed to the lesson that they should learn. But in a few weeks' time, the conversation surrounding superheroes is going to change completely because it's estimated now that Spider-Man Brand New Day might gross more than $500 million worldwide on its opening weekend, so stay tuned. But like I do every week, I like to get the opinions of the experts. So let's head over to Variety, where Rebecca Rubin has an article titled Box Office: Minions and Monsters Fizzles Over July 4th Weekend with Franchise Low $61 million Debut. Supergirl Suffers Brutal 74% Drop. Are the Minions losing their star power? Although Minions and Monsters, a 1920s Hollywood set prequel in the animated Despicable Me universe, led the box office over the 4th of July weekend, the well-reviewed family film didn't quite set off fireworks. It opened way behind projections with $36 million from 4,243 North American locations between Friday and Monday, and $61 million since Wednesday. Heading into the weekend, Minions and Monsters was aiming for $80 million over the 5-day frame. Initial sales are a huge drop from its predecessors and rank as the lowest start in the franchise, below even the original 2010's Despicable Me, which managed to earn $56 million, not adjusted for inflation, over the traditional weekend while introducing the yellow pill-shaped agents of chaos to the world. Box office watchers anticipated a softer turnout across the industry over the holiday weekend since July 4th landed on Saturday. They assumed that instead of going to theaters on the busiest day of the week for moviegoing, people would be attending barbecues and watching fireworks to celebrate America's 250th birthday. That likely accounted for some drop-off, but that doesn't explain such a massive opening weekend decline from the franchise's two most recent entries, 2022's spin-off sequel Minions: The Rise of Gru, and 2024's Despicable Me 4, which launched to $123 million and $122 million, respectively, over the same 5-day holiday stretch. After all, families didn't totally avoid the big screen. Toy Story 5 earned almost as much over the Friday to Sunday stretch, with $31 million from 3,975 venues in its third weekend of release. Disney and Pixar's kid-friendly film was number 2 at the domestic box office and boosted grosses to $366 million in North America and $764 million worldwide. For Minions and Monsters, which was received positively by audiences and critics, the disappointing domestic figure suggests the franchise is overexploited. There have been 7 Despicable Me chapters across 16 years, averaging a new adventure about every 2 years. That in contrast to Toy Story, which has benefited from scarcity, having produced only 5 installments over 30 years. There is good news for Universal and Illumination, the two companies behind the commercially successful property. Minions and Monsters is a hit at the international box office with $86 million over the weekend and $98 million to date, bringing the worldwide total to $159.8 million. And prior Despicable Me adventures and spin-offs have demonstrated notable box office staying power, so Minions and Monsters could stick around throughout the summer despite the slower start. Critics and audiences dug the movie, which is directed by series co-creator Pierre Coffin and holds a stellar 91% on Rotten Tomatoes and A- grade on CinemaScore exit polls. The film was produced for $85 million, making it slightly less expensive than prior entries, which cost around $100 million each. 7 installments is further than any animation series has gone. Audiences are showing fatigue now, says David A. Gross, who publishes the box office newsletter Franchise Re. The movie will be profitable, but it's a misfire. Elsewhere at the domestic box office, Supergirl endured a tragic 74% decline with $9.6 million from 3,602 screens in its sophomore outing. Rivals believe the final weekend number will be lower when estimates are officially tallied on Monday. After debuting to just $37.1 million domestically, the Warner Brothers and DC comic book adaptation has earned $58.5 million in North America and $100.5 million globally to date. Such a weak turnout underscores the challenges facing the once dominant box office genre of superhero movies, particularly those centered on lesser-known protagonists. Last year, Superman was a hit, and this month, Spider-Man Brand New Day is expected to be enormous. But those films feature A-list heroes. Everyone on the planet knows Clark Kent and Peter Parker. Supergirl and Marvel's 2025 adventure Thunderbolts, another recent theatrical misfire, revolved around characters who aren't household names. Given its hefty $170 million budget, Supergirl is projected to lose at least $100 million to $120 million in its theatrical run. And that figure could be even higher if the film fails to reach $200 million globally. And let me pause to interrupt because there's not a chance in hell that Supergirl is going to make it to $200 million globally. But another thing that always drives me crazy in the official box office analysis by Deadline and Hollywood Reporter and Variety, they almost never bring up the quality of individual movies. They never bring up the execution. They think, oh, well, if a character is recognizable, the movie will perform. And if the character is unrecognizable, it won't perform. But Thunderbolts was not a good movie. Supergirl was not a good movie. The Marvels was not a good movie. But there's like movies like Deadpool. Like when Deadpool came out in 2016, He was recognizable to comic book nerds who were reading like Rob Liefeld comics in the 1990s, but he was by no means a recognizable character worldwide. But on like a $60 million budget, the movie just exploded in popularity because the movie was good. It was hilarious. It had incredible action. Execution matters. Like, you have to deliver a superior final product. And I think we're at a point now where if a superhero movie is not excellent, it's just going to crash and burn, and deservedly so. But getting back to the article, Supergirl ranked number 4 on weekend charts behind Young Washington, which opened in third with an impressive $20.8 million from 2,700 theaters. The patriotic historical drama, whose release was smartly timed to Independence Day, was backed by faith-based Angel Studios. The company's inspirational films tend to be well received by their target demographic, and Young Washington was no different. The movie, which tells the story of George Washington before the American Revolutionary War and his presidency, earned an A grade on CinemaScore, in stark contrast to the 57% from critics on Rotten Tomatoes. The story is told from a patriotic, pro-American, and faith-oriented point of view, and the release coincides with the nation's 250th anniversary. Gross says, "There's limited potential overseas, but the domestic run should be good. Angel Studios knows how to reach this audience." A24's comedy The Invite managed to crack the top 10 with $800,700 while playing on just 28 screens. That brings the total haul to $1.36 million after 2 weekends and limited release. With great reviews, the movie's commercial appeal will be tested when it expands nationwide on July 10th. Directed by Olivia Wilde, The Invite stars her and Seth Rogen as a bickering married couple who hosts a dinner party for their far more free-spirited upstairs neighbors, Penelope Cruz and Edward Norton. Paramount's comedy Jackass Best and Last, which opened last week into week ticket sales, dropped to the number 8 spot with $2.7 million from 2,855 theaters, a harsh 68% decline. The R-rated film has generated a paltry $14.6 million domestically and $20 million worldwide, so it'll almost certainly wind up as the lowest grossing installment of the 5 films. However, Jackass 5 cost just $10 million to produce, so it doesn't need that much coinage to get out of the red. Although Hollywood is enjoying the best summer since COVID, this weekend was a setback in terms of the industry's recovery. At the end of June, popcorn season was 17% ahead of the same point in 2025 and 1.7% behind 2019, according to Rentrack. Now the summer stretch is 11.9% above 2025 and 7.25% behind 2019. Meanwhile, the year-to-date box office is up 13.2% from last year and 16% behind 2019. Next weekend brings another family film, Disney's live-action Moana, while Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey and Spider-Man Brand New Day are poised to close out July with a bang. When the 4th of July lands on a Saturday, it can have a negative impact on the box office, says Paul Degarbedian, Rentrack's head of marketplace trends. Nonetheless, theaters have been on a roll since the beginning of the year, with a summer movie season that is likely to be the biggest since 2019. If all goes to plan, summer will eclipse the $4 billion mark for only the second time in post-pandemic years. The first was 2023 when Barbie and Oppenheimer fueled a movie-going event for the ages. It's now up to Moana, Odysseus, and Peter Parker to carry the box office to the coveted milestone. Yeah, I don't know if Moana's going to do well because it's a live-action movie that looks a little ridiculous, and I never saw the original Moana, but we just had an animated sequel, and I think people just would rather have a Moana 3 than a live-action Moana. And The Odyssey, I really have no idea. It might play like Dunkirk, or it might play like The Dark Knight. It's all gonna, like, we've seen so little in the trailer apart from the terrible dialogue that it's really hard to know what to expect. But I imagine that the best action set pieces have been kept behind closed doors. So I need to see I need to see The Odyssey before I can make a prediction about its box office. But I think Spider-Man Brand New Day, there's a very good chance the movie might gross $2 billion. It might carry the summer box office all by itself. If it has an opening weekend of $500 million, I mean, who knows? It might end up grossing more than Spider-Man No Way Home, which would be an incredible feat.
I didn't know you could get that big.
But as far as this upcoming week is concerned, I'll be skipping the shit out of Moana, but I will be seeing Evil Dead Burn, which looks like it has some potential. I'm an Evil Dead fanatic, mostly about the originals, but I will see any movie called Evil Dead until the end of time. But I'll also be releasing a 50th anniversary review for The Outlaw Josie Wales, featuring my favorite Western kind of wingman, David Lambert. So stay tuned for that if you're a Clint Eastwood buff. But hope everybody had a great weekend. Hope everybody had a great July 4th. If you enjoyed this video, remember to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.